So this is a presentation of the Center for Future Consciousness, and I'm Tom Lombardo, who's going to be giving the presentation today. And the webinar today is the Evolution of Science Fiction, Module 18, Part 2, The New Millennium, the Last Decade, Science Fiction Literature Within the Last Decade. In case you're interested in Module 18, Part 1, that was on science fiction TV and cinema of the last decade, and you can access that on the YouTube channel with all the other webinar videos. I have a quote up here to begin with. We're in a science fiction novel as a culture. Science fiction is the realism of our time. Kim Stanley Robinson. And I think that quote's worth pondering a bit as we go through this today. What do you think Robinson is getting at by saying that we're in a science fiction novel in reality as a culture, and that science fiction is the realism of our time? And we'll get to Kim Stanley Robinson today, but I just wanted to mention that quote, highlight it, and have you ponder what it possibly means. Now, another thing on this opening slide I just want to note is the image that I used here is an old clip art from the 1990s that I always liked, which is rather cosmic, with the human face looking up into the heavens, somehow emerging out of Earth. And I always liked it because of its sense of humanity looking out into the heavens, emerging out of our ground. And in this webinar today, I'm going to be using a lot of artwork that is 30 years in evolution past this early piece of clip art that was created, I said, back in the 1990s. And I find this particular clip art interesting, but at the same time, we're going to see how clip art, or not clip art, but just graphics in general, have evolved over the last 30 years. So just to mention for those people who haven't come before, the mission of the Center for Future Consciousness is the purposeful evolution of humanity through the heightening of future consciousness and wisdom, and the inspirational, mythic, and cosmic power of science fiction. And a lot of what I write about and do in the Center for Future Consciousness has to do with science fiction, and has to do with how science fiction enhances our future consciousness. As Terry and I both have mentioned, there's a YouTube channel for the center. There's also a newsletter that comes out intermittently, Future Consciousness Insights. And I'm just putting up here my various published books on consciousness, future consciousness, the future. And the last three down there in the middle are the first three volumes of a history of science fiction. And the webinars I've been doing have been based first on the first three volumes, and then the webinars that have occurred dealing with science fiction since the 1940s will be published eventually in a number of succeeding volumes in this series. So this is all part of a book project at the same time as being a webinar series. In case you're interested, I have a copy of a compressed overall history of science fiction that's going to be published this spring in a Handbook of Futures by Roberto Poli. And in case you're interested in looking at a 25-page compressed a vision of the history of science fiction. And also there's a webinar up that I did back about a month or two ago, an accelerated history of science fiction as well. So that's a bit about the center, a bit about the books, a bit about these webinars. And as Terry mentioned, you could get access to all of these different links by going to the link tree that's up on the chat box. So I thought a good place to begin today, just to get an overview, is what are the novels that have won one of the four major awards for science fiction over the last decade? And this list is derived from an excellent website dealing with science fiction, Worlds Without End. And I know it's a bit overpowering to begin with to look at this, but I wanted to mention that we're going to actually talk about maybe 3/4 of the books on this list. Now, there's a lot of other science fiction awards besides the Hugo, Nebula, Locus, and the British Science Fiction Award, but I can't put them all up there. So these are what I think are the four major awards in the novels every year, beginning in 2011 up through 2023 that have won. And you'll see a lot of novels up there that you may be familiar with, and novels that won multiple awards. But like I said, we're probably going to go through about 3/4 of them. When I come to the end today, though, I'm going to give you my list of the best science fiction novels of the last dozen or so years, this last decade. And it lines up in a lot of ways with what's on this list, but in some ways it's a little bit different. So this list here, if you're interested, I could send it to you. You can go look at all the nominees for all these awards on Worlds Without End, plus all the other ones like the Clark and the Dick and the Otherwise Awards and the Campbell Award. There's a whole bunch of other awards that are giving out every year. So this is a big picture overview of a lot of what we're going to cover today. Now, the place I'm going to begin is with some of the masters of the past, present, and future. Three writers in particular who made their names and became very well known back in the 80s and 90s, but have continued to write and produce high quality science fiction up through this last 10 years. And the first one I want to highlight here is William Gibson. And he is, of course, very well known for his quote, "The future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed." But in the first part of the new millennium, Gibson, in fact, wrote three novels that did get some recognition in science fiction, but basically did not have to do with the future. Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, and Zero History. You may have read one or more of these. And Gibson, according to John Clute, the editor of the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, Gibson began to feel like there was no way to intelligently write about the future because we weren't sure about the present anymore and what the present was, and we had no coherent vision any longer about the future. So he wrote three speculative fiction novels that got some degree of attention back in the first decade. But then when we come up to the second decade, he returned to writing science fiction and returned to writing novels about the future. And the one I want to highlight here, The Peripheral, which was actually adapted to a TV series recently, deals with a future reality that is able to engage in time travel, but only through the transmission of information back into the past, and actually sets up a virtual reality system in our relatively current times and draws a woman and her brother into observing the future. But the woman who goes into this apparatus, which has been set up from the future, witnesses a murder in the future. The Peripheral is an artistically and rather cryptically written novel that's filled with an incredible array of technological inventions, aside from the fact of time traveling. Also involves a time war between two different factions in the future attempting to control the past, and it begins to manipulate the past, producing a second trajectory into a different future from the one that they actually exist within. And it's a mystery. As I said, it's very artistic. It's, I think, William Gibson's best novel in a long, long time, at least a couple of decades. It's really true to the science fiction spirit. And I think it's one of the better novels of the last decade or so. It continues with his second book in the series, Agency, which continues with the story of the manipulation of the past, and in fact, from the future. In fact, there's one character in this novel, in the novel series, who exists in the future, but also exists in a younger version in the present, who form a collaboration. So you have the same identity and two different time realities working together. So the book, as I said, is very inventive, very good, and it's very good Gibson with lots of technological speculations and lots of artistic and interesting visions of a future world in which most of humanity has disappeared. Now, the second writer that made his name in the past and continues to be very popular, Kim Stanley Robinson. There's a line up here I have from him. It's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, Robinson has been very prolific over the last 2 decades. It's in the last decade, of course, but the last 2 decades. And the beginning of the new millennium, he won Best Novel of the Year for The Years of Rice and Salt, which is an alternative history of the Earth, where the Black Plague actually kills 99% of the population of Europe, and how history would have gone differently if that significant event had come out differently back there in the 14th century. Then he wrote a 3-volume series, 40 Signs of Rain, 50 Degrees Below, and 60 Days and Counting, which deal with the issue of climate and the issue of the environment and the issue of the deterioration of the environment and climate change, and how this could lead to disasters and how we might be able to address freezing and flooding and a whole set of different ecological environmental disasters to emerge due to our transformation of our climate and of the environment. And this is a theme that Robinson is going to carry all the way up to the present, which is the challenge of what we can do to address the problems that we are creating, realizing it's a very complex challenge. But they're very good books to read for futurists, written back early in the millennium. Then he wrote what turned out to be a very popular book, Galileo's Dream, about Galileo being transported into the future and conversing with people from the future. A very interesting book about time travel and about Galileo and about his significance in history. He won the Nebula for 2312, and this came out in the year 2012, in the last decade. And 2312 is another ecological science fiction story. This one envisioning the creation of innumerable numbers of artificial ecosystems in hollowed out asteroids in the asteroid belt. And it's a very good ecological novel, ecological science fiction. It's got a good mystery to it. And I think it's one of the better books written in this last decade, and clearly one of Robinson's best as well, too. Then he did a space travel one a couple years later, Aurora, where it may be difficult, if not impossible, to really explore interstellar space, humans doing it. Then he wrote a book, another ecological book, 2140, about New York going underwater due to the melting of the ice caps and the sea level and the oceans rising. and then another book about the settlement of the moon. And then finally, that came out a couple of years ago, the one I want to highlight, The Ministry for the Future. And the Ministry for the Future starts about in the present and deals with a ministry, with a director who's responsible for convincing the world to change its ways, both in terms of its economics, in terms of its culture, its philosophy, to address the problem of climate change. This is a very dense and theoretically articulated and dramatized argument for how we can transform the world into a better reality than the kind of reality we are in today. It's definitely the kind of book that a futurist should read because it goes into an immense amount of what turns out to be rather didactic expositions about energy, the environment, climate, economics, and he pulls it all together into a narrative where a group of people actually try to work out, and it becomes a global movement, a transformation of human society. And I think it's one of the best things that Robinson ever wrote, and I definitely think it's worth reading, and it's one of the best novels of the last 10, 12 years, The Ministry for the Future. Now, the third writer who gained significance earlier, but has continued to write up and through the last decade, Neal Stephenson. And Neal Stephenson, just about the turn of the millennium, wrote a non-science fiction thriller, which got lots of attention, lots of awards, but it wasn't really science fiction, Cryptonomicon. And what Stevenson first shows in this novel is his propensity to write novels that are approaching 1,000 pages apiece. So Stevenson's a real challenge to read, given the length of his books, but his books are intellectually dense and very informative. Stevenson, of course, had written Snow Crash and The Diamond Age back in the 1990s. Just as an interesting little quote about Cryptomicon, it is a fact, a copy of Cryptomicon has more information per unit volume than any other object in this universe. Any place that a copy of the book exists, at that moment, the most information region of space-time in the universe. If you drop a carton of Cryptomicon paperbacks into a black hole of any size, the black hole doubles in size. It's true. I asked Stephen Hawking. You get my drift. It's the info dump of all info dumps. A person who has recently read this book is temporarily the smartest person on the earth. So that's how he comes into the new millennium with this massive, rather non-science fiction mystery about cryptography and spies and intelligence, but it doesn't really have to do with the future, and it isn't really science fiction. In fact, after that, he wrote 3 books about the 17th and 18th century in Europe, all of which were massive too, having to do with the controversy between who invented calculus, Leibniz or Newton. But hitting science fiction now, given the fact that he's already done these 4 early on in the new millennium, the next one he published, An Anthem, was, I think, his best thing of the last 10, 15 years. Now, I'm going to come back to it in a moment, but I just want to mention that he also published another non-science fiction, Reamd, and then he published a really good science fiction novel about exploration in the future, Seven Eves, and I'll come back to that too and highlight it a bit more. And then finally, Fall or Dodge in Hell, which has to do with virtual reality and the downloading of consciousness, and Termination Shock, which is the most recent one, which has to do with climate change and environmental problems. But the 2 I want to highlight here, the 2 that really stand out, An Anthem and Seven Eves. An Anthem envisions another world, which is got this incredibly detailed history to it. And the central characters in it all live in monasteries. And monasteries are spread all over the globe. And these monks in these monasteries are intellectuals who engage in extensive philosophical discussions about the nature of reality and consciousness. This is the most philosophical science fiction book, excepting maybe for Star Maker, that I've ever read. It's a massive piece of work. Eventually, the monks discover an alien spaceship circling the planet that turns out not to be an alien spaceship at all, but a spaceship from an alternative version of their own planet. And one of the set of beings who live on this spaceship are from the planet Earth, us. So this becomes a very provocative and interesting discussion about reality, about knowledge, about ontologies and myths. It's an amazingly rich book, a very big challenge to read it, but an amazingly rich book. Seven Eves starts off with the moon blew up without warning and for no apparent reason, and humanity has to get off the moon because get off the Earth because the moon and breaking up begins to produce steadily increasing this downpour of asteroids across the entire surface of the Earth and meteorites, excuse me. And humanity is only able to get about 1,000, 1,500 people up into a space station with a lot of arcs hooked onto it. And there's lots of trouble, lots of challenges. It's a big disaster novel. And then all of a sudden, after more and more trouble and the Earth being annihilated and everybody on it being killed, apparently, we jump ahead 5,000 years. And 5,000 years into the future, humanity has come back, but being children of the only 7 women who survived the disaster of our time. And they are the 7 Eves. It's a very good novel. It's got a very good ending to it. Actually, it's like 2 novels in one, the disaster part, and then the part 5,000 years in the future. But Stevenson, in my mind, wrote at least 2 of the best science fiction novels of the last decade, An Anthem and 7 Eves. Now, let's switch gears a little bit. Let's go look at the short stories, because lots of short stories, novellas, and other novelettes have been written over the last 15 years. And just in case you're, inclined to looking at shorter works of fiction, I just want to highlight some things out here about that. The best series, at least the most highly regarded series, was Gardner Dozois's Year's Best Science Fiction, which ran for close to, I think, 20 years. Yeah, in fact, closer to 30 years, and considered, like I said, the best anthology on short science fiction. So if you want to see what's being written in the short form, he's one place to go. Hartwell's Year's Best Science Fiction is also popular more recently. We have Horton's Best Science Fiction and Fantasy, which continues to be published every year. The Nebula Awards are published in Nebula Awards Showcase. In case you remember, they used to have an anthology every year or two for the Hugos, but they stopped doing it, so there's no longer any Hugo Award collections that come out, but the Nebula Award collections do come out every year. I wanted to just highlight one particular collection, Project Hieroglyph, which was instigated by Neil Stephenson, and it's a collection of stories that attempt to provide optimistic, positive visions of the future. Stevenson wrote an article in Wired magazine saying that nobody was having any big positive, exuberant images of the future anymore, that we were in a period of innovation starvation. And that article eventually developed under his stimulus into a collection of positive visions of the future. And as he put it, kind of return to the optimistic golden age visions. Now, besides collections like this, I just want to mention a good review of the 1940s by Alec Navala-Lee, which came out in the last 10 years, astounding. And this was a very interesting, detailed, good history of science fiction that dealing with the 1940s and the 1950s, focusing on Campbell, Asimov, and Heinlein and Hubbard. Now, one peer who produced lots of different anthologies and written about science fiction extensively over the last 10 years are the husband and wife team, Jeff and Ann Vandermeer. And they've done collections on the new weird science fiction, on steampunk science fiction, on time travel science fiction, and the Big Book of Science Fiction, which is a massive collection of short stories from science fiction going back to the 19th century up to the present. So they've been definitely into putting together various collections. So there's lots of collections around that have come out in the last 10 years. If you're interested in looking at short stories in science fiction and novellas, as opposed to novels. This would be the appropriate place then, of course, to bring up Ted Chiang, who has become the master of science fiction short stories over the last 2 decades. And Ted Chiang, educated as a computer engineer, doesn't write a lot, but what he writes is very good. And his short stories have been collected into 2 volumes, Stories of Your Life and Exhalation. And both books have won the Locus Award for best collections of stories for that year. And the best way to describe Ted Chiang is he writes metaphysical, philosophical science fiction. Sometimes it doesn't exactly even seem like science fiction, what he's doing. Now, I have up here what I think are his best stories that come out of those 2 books. And to follow up on my theme about, is his stuff science fiction or not? The first story that he published that he won Best Short Story of the Year for was The Tower of Babylon. And The Tower of Babylon is actually a story about a man who climbs this giant tower that has been built in ancient Babylon. And when he gets to the top of it, he finds a group of people having contacted the firmament that the tower reaches up to, attempting to dig a hole into the firmament to see what's on the other side. So this is an alternate reality. And Understand, though, is pure science fiction and provides, I think, the most realistic and detailed vision of the future evolution of a human mind to a hyper level of intelligence and cognition. Really excellent story. Story of Your Life, which was made into the movie Arrival. 72 Letters, which is an alternate reality in which technology is created by people coming up with the correct magical words to create the technologies. The Merchant and the Alchemist Gate, all of these won Nebulas or Hugos, by the way. But a man trying to manipulate his history by trying to improve it, and every time he tries to improve it through time travel, things go backwards. Exhalation, which is a story about a robot who wants to figure out how his brain works, so he pulls his brain apart, keeping it all hooked together with this collection of mirrors, and does dissections on his own brain to study its own workings. Fantastically good story. The lifestyle of software objects, about virtual reality pets, and Amphalos, which is about an alternate reality in which it appears that humans were instantaneously created in the past. They believe in God, but now they've discovered that maybe all the beliefs are invalid because of some recent scientific discoveries. These are thought pieces. They're not that long. They're very philosophical, and as I said, very metaphysical, and they grab you. He's been a really excellent science fiction writer at the short story length and novella length in this last decade and two. Now let's turn to some more recent science fiction writers, male ones to begin with, then I'll turn to the women writers. John Scalzi, who won in 2005 Best New Writer in Science Fiction, and was an avid writer of science fiction, having flipped a coin to see whether he wanted to spend his career writing mystery or science fiction novels, and the coin came up science fiction, and so that's where he devoted himself over the last 20 years or so. He created a blog, Whatever, which ended up winning a Hugo for Best Related Book, and one of the two collections of it, as you could look and see that he's a rather funny character, Your Hate Mail Will Be Graded, A Decade of Whatever. Scalzi is the entertaining comedian of contemporary science fiction. He first made his name as a writer with his novel Old Man's War. This is about 2005. And it's about a future in which people who are old can be given a brand new techno-enhanced body with the possibility of living indeterminately into the future if they're willing to fight in a dangerous war with aliens where the chance of their survival is 1 out of 10. So, given the promise of immortality, given your body is wearing out already, and here's a chance to have a brand new green skin body and be incredibly more intelligent and a greater physical strength, would you take that opportunity? And so that's how this series begins. Old Man's War, The Last Colony, The Ghost Brigade, Zoe's Tale. This is an ongoing series he wrote, and it's where he first made a name as a science fiction writer after being a commentary, a fan for 20 years and writing lots of commentary on science fiction. After that, he wrote a spin-off of Philip K. Dick's Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep called The Android's Dream, in which a man goes looking for a particular kind of sheep called android sheep. And that's another comical one. But then he breaks through into awards, big awards. First one wins the Hugo, 2012, Red Shirts. Imagine you're on a ship. It's sort of like Star Trek, and you're an individual who has a lesser role in the command structure of the ship. And you begin to notice that lots of your cohorts keep getting killed, but your officers never get killed. And you eventually find out from a character who's on the ship that all of your adventures are really episodes in a TV series that was written back in our contemporary times, where this was supposedly taking place in the 24th century. So this novel is a spoof on Star Trek. At the same time, it's an interesting experiment in reality to realize that you're a character in a screenplay and on a TV show, and the characters end up trying to go back to the past and get the writers of the screen of the TV series to make their episodes more realistic without continually killing off all the low red shirts. A few years later, he won Best Novel of the Year again for Collapsing Empire. Again, funny, again, very action-packed, set in the future with excellent villains. And then just this last year, won Best Novel of the Year again for the Kaiju Preservation Society, based on the idea that Godzilla is real, that the atomic bombs that went off during World War II and testing afterwards opened up a hole between this Earth and a parallel Earth in which giant kaiju, meaning giant monsters from the Japanese, one of them penetrated through. And this is a story about a group of individuals, the Preservation Society, who try to keep these giant monsters in this parallel universe without coming into the Earth. It's, again, very, very funny, again, very entertaining. If you like something which is engaging, John Scalzi is a really excellent person to read. His stories are inventive and his characters are funny. And the episodes, the premises of them are the same way. And so he's been a very, very popular science fiction writer of the last 10 years. 3 best novels. Jeff Vandermeer, who I've mentioned already, as an editor of a number of anthologies, also has written science fiction and fantasy. To begin with, he started off in kind of surrealistic fantasy with Finch. He wrote a Hugo-winning book on how to write science fiction called Wonder Book. And then he made his name as a science fiction writer with the trilogy, the Southern Reach trilogy, Annihilation, Acceptance, and Authority. The first volume, of course, was made into a movie. And in the first volume, Annihilation, which I think is vastly stranger, more inventive and interesting than the movie, one of the characters discovers a tunnel leading into the ground in this mysterious area called Area X, where people go into it but never seem to come out. And as she's descending into this tunnel, she sees written on the wall in some kind of organic life form that's continually creating this script, where lies the strangling fruit that came from the hand of the sinner. I shall bring forth the seeds of the dead. And this is a very spooky novel, very strange, very inventive. And he won the Nebula for it as Best Novel of the Year. And it's another one of the better novels of the last 10 years. He's continued to write fantasy combination with science fiction novels since. Acceptance and Authority, by the way, I did not think were anywhere near as interesting as the first volume in the series, Annihilation. But this area seems to have become possessed by some kind of alien force, and the series ended up actually, some of the volumes got onto the bestseller list, New York Times bestseller list. So that's another good one of the last 10 years, Annihilation. Now we come to Adrian Tchaikovsky. And by the way, Adrian Tchaikovsky, his name is actually spelled C-Z-A-G, not the typical spelling that's put on his novels. He's Polish, and that's a Polish last name. And he's obviously an interesting looking character who for quite a long time published a whole series of fantasy novels struggling to get his stuff accepted and published, and eventually did win a British Fantasy Award for The Tiger and the Wolf. So at the beginning, he's a fantasy writer, although his majors in college were psychology and zoology. So he had a scientific background, but started off writing fantasy. And then in 2015, he published Children of Time, which Peter Hamilton calls the smartest evolutionary world building you'll ever read. And Children of Time, I always recommend to people to read as one of those really great science fiction novels and exceedingly inventive, because what Tchaikovsky does in this novel is he imagines a world that has been stimulated into accelerated evolution by humans in the future, but what happens accidentally is what gets accelerated into evolution are spiders. And so Tchaikovsky creates this saga of the evolution of a spider civilization built upon chemical messaging, intricate web forms, where they eventually reach a level of technological and intellectual evolution equal, if not superior, to humans, and at the end have to confront humans. It's an amazing feat of scientific, thoughtful, intricate speculation on the evolution of intelligence in a non-human form. Just blows you away, his vision of the spiders. Then, a few years later, he publishes a sequel, Children of Ruin, which takes up right where Children of Time leaves off. And in this novel, having already articulated this vision of intelligent spiders, lays out a scenario involving the evolution of technologically sophisticated, intelligent octopi on an alien world. And his vision isn't quite up to the intricacy of the spiders, but it's still very fascinating to see how he envisions how octopus could become intelligent. And then he throws in, on top of it all, another form of intelligence that has a genetic structure that's more complicated than DNA and can adopt any form it wants to. And there's a conflict between the octopi and the nods, which are this other form of intelligence. So he actually outdoes himself in this regard by envisioning two different forms of alien intelligence, both of which are very, very different than human intelligence. And both of these books, I think, are just really excellent, two of the best of the last decade. He wrote a number of other novels since, The Doors of Eden and Shards of Earth, which won Best Science Fiction Novel of the Year, the British Award, and The Elder Race, and then finally Children of Memory, the third volume in the series, and City of Last Chances. So Tchaikovsky's won several awards, in fact, I think 4 or 5 here, for Best Novel of the Year. The series, the Children of Time series, won Best Series in 2023, the Hugo, but he turned it down because he thought the voting was kind of screwed up and corrupted, but it did win. And those are definitely two of the best science fiction novels, I think, of the last 10 years. And he continues to write up to the present. Now, the next writers up here are two writers who together gave themselves a single author's name. Ty Franck and Daniel Abraham called themselves James S.A. Corey on their novels. That was their pseudonym. And in roughly about 10 years, if I have it straight, let me just check, between 2011 and 2021, wrote 9 consecutive space operas, The Expanse, beginning with Leviathan Wakes. The first 4 or 5 of these, maybe the first 6, formed the basis of the TV series The Expanse. But the series goes way beyond the plot, the characters, the events that are covered in the TV series. Maybe they'll finish it out over the next decade or so. But in 10 years, wrote 9 space operas, really good writing, really excellent adventures in outer space, begins in the future, begins with the solar system having been settled, Mars and the asteroid belt, with a strange, enigmatic alien intelligence that's discovered and infiltrating into various parts of human society. It's a complex cultural, political vision that's created, very action-packed, super characters. Can't say enough good about Leviathan Wakes and the whole series. And as it won the Hugo Award for Best Series in 2020, and 6 out of the 9 novels got nominated when they came out for Best Novel of the Year. The one that won, Abaddon's Gate, has to do with the gate opening up, the portal opening up out near the orbit of Uranus, and a whole number of worlds emerging through traveling through the portal. But very inventive, very well written, very good, a super piece of work, and they did 9 of them in 10 years. Now, the next one, male writer, we become more global, international with him. Levi Tidhar. He grew up on a kibbutz in Israel, has a huge amount of international connections with science fiction writers across the globe. We'll come back to that. Has been described as writing slipstream, which is a combination of fantasy, alternate realities, science fiction, crossing over genres. He is, for considering the issue of writing, style, creativity, the art of writing, he is definitely one of the best of the last 10 years. His stuff is beautiful to read, very strange, very inventive, beginning with his novel Osama, which is an alternate reality in which somebody writes a fictional work about a terrorist called Osama bin Laden, but it's a fictional novel about the terrorist Osama bin Laden. It's an alternate reality. The Violent Century, another alternate reality in which in the 1930s, the Germans developed the capability to enhance human bodies, and superheroes emerged during World War II and fight it out with each other. A Man Lies Dreaming, all of these get awards, by the way, and often in fantasy as opposed to science fiction. A Man Lies Dreaming, we have a character called Wolf who has left Germany and is a detective who's looking for a Jewish woman, and Wolf is Adolf Hitler, but not an Adolf Hitler that led the German Third Reich, but an Adolf Hitler who ran away from Germany and became a detective. But then he definitely got into science fiction with, I think, one of the best science fiction novels of the last 10 years, Central Station. It's all a science fiction distilled into a single book, is one quote about this novel. It takes place in the distant future in the twin cities of Tel Aviv and Jaffa, with a multicultural population that lives around Central Station, which is this giant structure miles high with this immense platform that serves as like an airport for going between the Earth and all the planets within the solar system. What makes the novel so good, aside from the fact that he's a beautiful writer, great sensory detail, is that he incorporates multiple cultures and strange technological realities, including beings that suck data out of other people's minds, who are like Shamblu or Medusas, and derelict robots who are struggling to stay alive. But he combines culture, strange characters, lots of sensory detail, and very odd relationships going on among them, so that you get a very powerful slice of life in an imagined future world, a global reality too, for that matter. It's one of those kinds of science fiction books like Robita's The 21st Century, where you really feel like you're in this reality. It's not just simply an adventure in outer space or something that highlights some one particular feature of the future. It gives you a gritty sense of what the future could conceivably be like. In this case here, very multicultural, as I mentioned. So Central Station, you have to read it to get this experience of being transported to this futurist reality, which is highly realistic and at the same time highly fantastical. And he's continued to write since then other strange books. Unholy War, where the Jews do not get Israel, they get some part of Africa to settle in. And The Escapement, which sends you off into something like a Western reality, alternate reality. And then recently, Neo, which goes back to the future world of Central Station. But Central Station, I definitely would recommend reading that if you've never read it. Now, a few other males to mention, male writers. Andy Weir, who started off writing a webcomic series called Casey and Andy, and eventually, having studied space technology and science, tried to write a realistic story about being stranded on Mars, The Martian, which got made into a movie that hit #1 on the bestseller list, in which one character left behind on Mars, thought to be dead, has to struggle to survive against multiple challenges, one after another. The book sold very well, but I sort of found it boring. Artemis, which takes place on the moon, and Hail Mary, which is his most recent book, which has to do with contact and alien intelligence, and also was a book on the bestseller list. Andy Weir has made his name in pop culture, at least with a couple novels that have sold out well outside of science fiction. And then Ernest Cline, who grew up on Dragons and Dungeons and Star Wars movies and video games, and wrote a screenplay that turned into a movie called Fanboys about a bunch of Star Wars nuts who go looking for Lucas Skywalker Ranch. But then he wrote his significant novel in science fiction, Ready Player One, which takes place in a dystopian future reality in which everybody has access to this virtual reality of Oasis, where they go, where they are able to escape the misery of the world that they live in. And in the game of Oasis, there is a game that has emerged, created by the creator of Oasis. If you could find the 3 magical keys, you will become the owner of the whole system. Now, the thing about Ready Player One and it started off getting positive reviews, eventually got negative ones, is that I think it's the most realistic, detailed, rich picture of virtual reality ever created in a science fiction novel. A lot of it is gaming, but it really pulls you in to what living in virtual reality would be like, which these characters in the novel do. Now, finally, just briefly, two other noteworthy male writers of the last 10 years, Sam Miller, Blackfish City, which is a story about a floating city with a woman who's nano-bonded together with an orca whale and a polar bear. Very fascinating story about a floating city. Sort of reminded me of China Miéville's The Scar, but very good. Boys, Beasts, and Men won Locus Award for Best Collection. It's his collection of short stories, and lots of his short stories have been nominated for Best Short Stories of the Year. Blackfish City, I'd recommend, is a good, interesting novel about the future. And then Gareth Powell, space opera, started writing back and right after the turn of the millennia. His stories are collected in Last Reef, but then he won Best Novel of the Year, British Science Fiction Award, for a story about an alternate reality, World War II, where the ace pilot for the British is a cigar-smoking chimpanzee who wears revolvers around his hips, and Akak Makak. And that became the first of a number of books that were space opera books that he wrote: Embers of War, Fleet of Knives, and Light of Impossible Stars, and finally Stars and Bones. All of these novels have been either nominated or won the British Science Fiction Award for Best Novels of the Year. So that's a good place to stop, to take a 5-minute break here before, and then okay. So I'm going to turn now to women science fiction writers of the last decade or so. And as I mentioned in the intro, women writers have really dominated best novels of the year in the Locus, Hugo, and Nebula awards, much more so than men have won for those awards. And I'm going to begin with the woman who won the 2011 Nebula, Hugo, and British Science Fiction Award for Best Novel of the Year, Jo Walton. And Jo Walton started off writing alternate realities. Again, we get alternate realities popping up quite frequently in science fiction. Farthing and My Real Children, and often they are set around issues having to do with World War II. We have a different scenario played out in Farthing, where Charles Lindbergh becomes president of the United States, and America never gets into World War II, and the Soviet Union and Germany fight to a stalemate. It's a different reality from where we're in now. And My Real Children, where there is a woman who has two sets of memories, one of which Kennedy is assassinated in, and another one he isn't. And so those are both alternate reality novels. And Farlane actually got nominated, and My Real Children got nominated for various fantasy awards. Now, the one I want to highlight, among others, which won the Hugo, Nebula, and the British Science Fiction Award, among others, is not really a science fiction novel. It's a fantasy novel about science fiction. The central character, a young girl, her mother is a psychotic witch who tortures her, and she is an outcast, both from her family. Her sister has been killed, murdered by the mother, and she's an outcast in the school she goes to. And what she does through the whole novel is she retreats into the reading of science fiction. So in a fantasy novel, we have a character who's a science fiction nut who retreats from reality by reading science fiction. And it's a very personal and literary story about her struggles to maintain her sense of identity, specialness with powers, supernatural powers, but with a mindset that's in love with the reality of science fiction. So I actually call it, science fiction as a way of life, because it does a very good job of depicting a hypothetical character who lives in the reality of science fiction as opposed to the reality that we have around us, and also has special powers on top of it all, and has a mother who is a witch. Excuse me. And a lot of times we're going to see science fiction getting mixed up together with fantasy, and the two not being all that clearly defined or separated. And among others is a good example of missing the two genres together. Joel Walton is a longtime fan of reading science fiction, but has written primarily things that you wouldn't exactly call science fiction and call more like fantasy, but among others won all the awards that year for Best Novel of the Year when it came out. Now then, Joel Walton did a really interesting experiment, a trilogy, beginning with The Just City, The Philosopher Kings, and Necessity. This is all in the last 10 years. Now, this is fantasy again, but with science fiction and philosophical elements. We have the god and goddess of Apollo and Athena creating this society in a remote part of Greece, sometime in the distant past, in which they try to create a world modeled on Plato's Republic, a city modeled on Plato's Republic. And we follow this experiment through 3 novels that eventually take us off the Earth and into outer space, where a city is settled in outer space that's called Plato. And it's a mixing together of fantasy, gods and goddesses, philosophical theory, and a bit of science fiction thrown in at the end. And the last volume actually did get nominated for the Locus Award that year. Now, in the meantime, she's also done books about science fiction. 2 that have won awards are the volumes, Informal History of the Yugos, which got nominated for the Hugo, and What Makes This Book So Great, Rereading the Classics of Science Fiction, which won the Locus Award for Best Nonfiction about Science Fiction. And these are 2 interesting books with her thoughts on what science fiction is all about. So you can see her as a writer about science fiction and the philosophy of it. And she's, of course, as I mentioned, she's a very good, engaging, personal writer, and they're worth looking at. But if you want to pick one out up there to read, if you're interested in something a bit different, among others. Then we come to a lady, Annie Leckie. And Annie Leckie got bored being a housewife. And when she got bored being a housewife, she decided she would become a writer. And she began to write back and just around the turn of the millennium, and ended up actually studying with Octavia Butler. And it took her roughly 10 years to write her first novel, which Ancillary Justice, when it came out, won almost all the awards for Best Novel of the Year. It takes place in the future, where we have spaceships, which are conscious and intelligent AIs. They are hooked together with hundreds, if not thousands, of crew members who form a collective mind on the spaceship, between the spaceship and all of the humans who run the spaceship. And the story is premised on the idea that something or somebody has told the crew to kill and assassinate the captain. And one of the crew members goes off on this trek to try to figure out why the captain was assassinated. Now, keep in mind, we have a reality here of collective artificial intelligence. And she has to journey to the planetary home of the emperor of the great system of which she, interplanetary interstellar system, which she is part. And it turns out that the emperor is best way to describe him would be schizophrenic, where the emperor actually has multiple versions of its personality, of its mind, downloaded into different incarnations, of which there are many, many of them. And the different personalities of the emperor are in competition, lethal competition with each other. So we have this split, bifurcated, multivated consciousness among the rulers of the empire. And we have this AI-enhanced individual who was part of the collective intelligence of a spaceship out to find him and to kill him for having murdered, presumably, the captain. This saga goes on through 3 novels, Ancillary Sword and Ancillary Mercy, in which those novels didn't get quite as many awards as the first one, but continue the storyline of the central character trying to track down and deal with this schizophrenic emperor who's ruling this empire and has multiple bodies all over the place. And so by the time we come to the end here, we have the interesting development, and this does pertain to what you were talking about during the break, that the AIs of this future reality are petitioning to be treated as independent, autonomous, and sentient species distinct from humanity who have all the rights that humans do. So they eventually get to the point where they want to have this sense of equality with humanity. By the way, in Ted Chiang's story, the life cycle of software objects, the virtual reality pet at the end wants to have the right of self-determination for its own future and what it wants to do, and not just simply be a toy of humanity, and decides that he's going to become a sex worker. And that's at the end of the life cycle of software objects. But we have this issue coming up here about are AIs autonomous? Should they be treated as equal to humanity, et cetera, et cetera? And then she's continued it with a new series now, Providence, that takes place in the same future reality that the Ancillary series took place in too. The next woman science fiction writer, and I would basically call N.K. Jemisin a fantasy writer, not a science fiction writer, but she has won the Hugo and the Nebula and the Locust a number of times over the last 10, 12 years. At the beginning, she wrote primarily just fantasy, 100,000 Kingdoms, and The Killing Moon, and she did win the Locust Award for Best Fantasy Novel for the 100,000 Kingdoms. But then in 2015, she published the 5th season, which won the Hugo for Best Novel, and it was the first time an African American had ever won the Hugo for Best Novel. And the 5th season takes place in this hypothetical other world where there are beings on this world, human-like beings, who have the mental power to disrupt physical forces and turn people into stone. And one disgusted and depressed individual possessing those powers has generated this huge crack down the middle of the globe and starts this disaster going. And we follow the exploits of one woman character in particular as she has to deal with this disaster, deal with finding her gifted daughter, deal with people who are prejudiced against her, and combat and somehow rectify this fifth season, this world of incredible disruption. And this continues through the Obelisk Gate and the Stone Sky. And each of those won Best Novel either for the Hugo or the Nebula. The Obelisk won the Hugo, and the Stone Sky won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locust. But they're primarily fantasy as opposed to science fiction. Her short stories are collected together in How Long Till Black Futures Month, and that won the Locust Award that year for Best Collection. And then another one that won for the novelette Emergency Skin, and then our most recent one, The City We Became, which comes close to being a science fiction novel, because in this hypothetical reality, we have cities who are personified through avatars. And it deals with the avatars of New York City, where the old avatar controlling New York City has died, and they are trying to come together and coalesce into a new collective avatar that rules the city. So that comes close to being science fiction. Now, the next woman writer up here that I want to talk about, Nadie, and I'm going to make sure I pronounce her name right, Okorafor. And Nadie is an exponent of African futurism. And here's a statement from her. African futurism is concerned with visions of the future, is interested in technology, leaves the earth, skews optimistic, is centered on and predominantly written by people of African descent, Black people, and it is rooted first and foremost in Africa. It is less concerned with what could have been and more concerned with what is and can be. It acknowledges and grapples with and carries what it acknowledges, and it acknowledges, I lost where I was on that. And it's more concerned, it acknowledges, grapples with, and carries what has been. And Nadine writes science fiction and fantasy that primarily takes place in Africa. And she's written a lot of award-winning stuff. Early on, she won fantasy awards for Who Fears Death, Lagoon, which takes place in Nigeria, and aliens invade Nigeria. The Book of Phoenix, which involves biological, technological enhanced humans who are from Nigeria, and one particular character in particular, especially. And then she wrote a series of novellas, beginning with Binti, and then several others in the same series, about a young girl, very, very smart young girl who grew up in Nigeria and becomes the first person from that country to get accepted into this university that's in outer space. It takes place in the future. And Binti is a very fascinating character since she covers herself in red clay and has this huge, elaborate hairstyle, sort of like Nadi's hairstyle. And she gets on this ship to travel to this other planet, and it gets invaded by aliens who kill all the other humans on the ship, except for her. And she develops this communication with these aliens. And eventually, in order to communicate with the aliens more effectively, she has to become part alien herself. And so she grows these extra body parts on her to become more in tune with the aliens. And the stories Binti and the ones that followed up won a number of awards, and she's become a very popular writer of African futurist uh, fantasy and science fiction. Interestingly, her last novel, Noor, involves a woman who is physically disabled and is given technological enhancements. And she lives in Nigeria also. And the parallel here is that Nadi didn't start writing until she was 19 and was in an accident which paralyzed her from the waist down. And as a way of something to do, not being able to walk, she started to write at 19 and eventually started to write fantasy and then eventually started to write science fiction. So the last story has a bit of the autobiographical suggestion in it too. So a very colorful writer and definitely somebody to read to see how science fiction or fantasy gets written from an African perspective. Mary Robinette Kowal, who has been, along like with John Scholes, they forgot to mention, past presidents of the American Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. And Mary first won an award for outer space, a short story, For Want of a Nail, involving fixing an AI while in outer space. But where she really made her name was when she got into her Lady Astronaut of Mars series. First with a novella that got nominated for the Hugo and for the Locus, about a lady astronaut who is old, living on Mars, who has to decide between whether she wants to go exploring the stars or leave her dying husband. And that became the endpoint of the novel series that she would write, beginning with The Calculating Stars. Now, The Calculating Stars came out in 2018, and it won the Hugo, Nebula, and Locus awards for Best Novel of the Year. It's an alternate history. The President of the United States in 1952 was Thomas Dewey, excuse me. And a meteorite collides with the Earth, obliterating Washington, D.C., and we have the same scenarios we had in Seven Eves a couple years earlier. Humanity has to get off the planet because the planet is going to fall apart into a total chaos and ecological disaster due to this meteor hitting the Earth, and the oceans are going to boil in this case. And humanity has to find a way to get up into the solar system where they don't have computers. And their best calculators, the calculating stars, are all women. And the central character is a woman who must work her way against male prejudice till finally, at the end of the first novel, she becomes the first human to go to the moon. And a lot of people liked it. It's a very interesting story. It sort of is more interesting in the first part than it is as it goes along. And but as I said, it won, 3 of the 4 major awards and was followed by 2 other novels in the series, The Faded Sky and Relentless Moon, where we follow the central character as she first of all ends up going to the moon and then going to Mars. And in the end, in The Lady Astronaut of Mars, which she wrote first, having to decide whether to leave her husband and go out and explore the stars. And she started a new series now, beginning with The Spare Man, which people have described as like The Thin Man, but with a woman character in it having a lot more to do with solving the crimes than in the original Thin Man series. Next one, Martha Wells. And Martha Wells started writing fantasy back, in the 1990s. And eventually she won an award for The Death of the Necromancer, one among, I think, over a dozen fantasy novels she wrote back then, that has parallels to a Sherlock Holmes story with characters that seem like parallels to Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson and Dr. Moriarty, etc. Now, that fantasy writing career was going on there for at least 15, 16 years. And interestingly, I ran across a speech she gave at a science fiction convention, not actually science fiction, real fantasy convention, about how women have systematically been ignored and minimized in the history of fantasy and science fiction. And that's her giving the talk, and the title of the talk is Unbury the Future. And it's an interesting speech about how history gets systematically and selectively written by those who happen to be in power, and how there have been lots of women writers in science fiction and fantasy that have been ignored or been minimized. Now, that same year that she gave that speech at a fantasy convention, she published All Systems Red, which won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locust for Best Novella. And All Systems Red introduces Murderbot. That's his name. That's what he calls himself. Murderbot is a cyborg, takes place in the future. Murderbot is hired to guard humans. Murderbot, though, doesn't like humans and is continually making cynical and comical remarks about having to interact with humans. Murderbot has, without humans knowing this, has had his control system detached from his body so that he doesn't necessarily have to obey the directions of humans. And All Systems Red is a first story taking him on an adventure to another planet and a scientific investigation going on that planet, where he has to encounter other cyborgs that are like him and battle with them, the whole time trying to keep humans alive, while he, in fact, is often getting wounded and continually making comical remarks. He is an excellent character, very, very funny, and you eventually discover that he called himself Murderbot. That's the name he gave himself, because in the recent past, he had presumably murdered 57 humans. In the second novel or story in the series, Artificial Condition, he goes in search of finding out what went wrong such that he ended up killing 57 humans. And again, he's comical, etc., an entertaining story. Now, one thing I should just mention as I get into the next one, Network Effect, is that Mary Wells kind of breaks the stereotype of a woman can't write high-tech, high-scientific science fiction. Mary Wells, or Martha Wells, excuse me, has lots of high-tech science in her novels. Network Effect won the Best Novel of the Year. In 20, won the Hugo, the Nebula, and the Locust, and it continues with the adventures of Murderbot. Now we have an intelligent spaceship that is ART, which is short for Asshole Research Transport, who Murderbot becomes friends with in one of the stories in the series. And Murderbot has to contend with both the humans, who are inept at times, and with various nasty characters who are trying to screw things up. Up to this point in time, we have 7 published stories in this series. The Murderbot series, it won Best Series in 21, the Hugo for it. the best thing about them is the character Murderbot, I would say. I mean, the science fiction stories themselves are kind of traditional, but he is very, very funny and interesting. And even though he's in some sense referred to as like a robot, he really is a cyborg. He's half flesh and half machine, but doesn't see himself as human, but see himself as responsible for defending humans and protecting them. Now we come to Dr. Anna Linda Weller, who has a PhD in Byzantine history, but at some point decided she wanted to start writing science fiction and took the pseudonym of Arcady Martini. And in 2019, she won the Hugo for her first science fiction novel, A Memory Called Empire. We're out into the future again. Excuse me. We're out into space again. Whoa, something just happened. Oh, sorry, something just went flaky here. Okay, there we are. Okay, whatever that was. Humans have settled lots of planets, have created this empire. The center of the empire, the emperor is dying. And this woman is sent from a other planet to become the new ambassador representing that planet to the emperor. The emperor, though, wants this technology that this small little planet possesses, where he can download his consciousness into a new body. The ambassador, the woman, she has come to the planet because the previous ambassador has been murdered, unknown why, and she's supposed to have the previous ambassador's consciousness in her mind, but it seems to have disappeared or gone dormant. And so we end up in this elaborate and intricate world-building future reality with poets and art and history, this giant, immense empire with an emperor who wants to live forever and a woman ambassador who's trying to figure out the politics of this world. And so it's partially space opera, partially a social, political, cultural invention. So it's very rich and very good in a lot of ways, and it won Best Novel that year. And then 2 years later, she continues the adventure with A Desolation Called Peace, which again won the Hugo for Best Novel of the Year. Now, I saved what I think is the best woman writer of the last decade for last, Charlie Jane Anders. And Charlie Jane Anders, based out of San Francisco, has been the MC for a award-winning event that goes on in San Francisco called Writers with Drinks. And she's also been somebody who's done a lot of fan writing and has actually won the Hugo, Our Opinions Are Correct, for Best Fan Cast. And so she's been active as a writer, as a speaker, as a rather entertaining character. I showed you a short video of her last time, for a good 20 years. And in the science fiction realm, I think around 2010, 2011, she wrote a story that won the Hugo for Best Novelette, 6 months, 3 days, about two people who could see into the future, who fall in love with each other, one of who sees only one determinate future and one who sees many possibilities. And it's a romance between these two and an ongoing philosophical debate about whether the future is certain versus whether the future has possibilities. After she wrote that, she spent the next 5 years through 6 drafts, finally publishing her first science fiction novel, All the Birds in the Sky. And All the Birds in the Sky is a very inventive and electrifying piece of work. It involves two young people, a girl and a boy. The girl has the powers of a witch. The boy is a computer nerd and develops fantastical computer systems in his bedroom. Both of them are bullied and ostracized by the kids that they go to school with, and they have all kinds of misfortunes early on in their life. But the girl ends up eventually going to school for witches, and the boy joins this bunch of scientifically minded partners who are trying to build a wormhole to escape from the Earth because the Earth is falling apart and deteriorating, and they have to confront each other, magic versus science. When I started reading it, she reminds me of Kurt Vonnegut. She has that kind of entertaining style. The book gets incredibly and mesmerizingly intricate and colorful the longer you go into reading it. I definitely give it 2 thumbs up for a novel of the last 10 years, definitely worth reading. But then after that, she wrote a second very good one, The City in the Middle of the Night, which came out a few years ago, about a world in which humans live on a planet that's locked, tidally locked, and one side always faces the star and the other side is in the darkness, and there are beings on the planet who are referred to by the humans as crocodiles, but actually don't look like crocodiles and are telepathic. And it's a very interesting and entertaining story, again, with a couple young women central characters. And it's another one of the better books of the last 10 years. And then her short stories collected in Even Greater Mistakes. And then finally, she won the best novel last year for young adult science fiction, Victories Greater Than Death, about somebody who is a young person who's drawn in to fighting aliens in outer space. So that's the key women science fiction writers, at least the ones that I ended up highlighting, that have won lots of awards, finally ending with Charlie Jane Anders, who I personally thought those two by her were the 2 best of the women authors of the last 10, 12 years. Okay, now a final part in the webinar. I'm going to switch to global world science fiction. Now, in the past, I've talked about non-English speaking writers in science fiction. And I have up here a number of them who I've talked about in various other webinars: Kurt Laswith, Rosny the Elder, Zamiatin Čapek, Czechoslovakia, Stanislaus Lem, Poland, Rabida, France, Borges, Argentina, Matsunaga, Italy, and Kashiro Otama from Japan, from Akira. And so we have been covering, or I have been covering, at least European science fiction to some degree outside of Great Britain and the United States. I should also note that back in the 1950s, to include another significant science fiction writer, this time the brothers Strakowski from Russia, that various anthologies were produced back in the 50s and 60s covering Soviet science fiction and French science fiction. And then I think I mentioned earlier that if you're interested in the history of Eastern European and Russian science fiction, the Illustrated History of Science Fiction, which came out in 1990s, has a good deal of material dealing with, Eastern and Russian science fiction, of which there is an incredible amount and has been over at least the last century, if not more so. I mentioned earlier Anne and Jeff Mandever's The Big Book of Science Fiction, which organizes its stories chronologically and includes quite a number of stories outside of Great Britain and the United States. If you go to the Encyclopedia of Science Fiction, and Wikipedia, the science Encyclopedia of Science Fiction in particular, you could find sections on science fiction in Germany, Russia, Japan, China, et cetera, et cetera. So the point being that I'm emphasizing here is that I have talked about it. There is a lot more to talk about. And in contemporary times, science fiction has definitely become very global in scope and not just simply English speaking, not just simply European, but science fiction has definitely spread across the entire globe. And Lavar Tidhai, who I had introduced before as the writer of Central Station, has been actively involved over the last 10 years, besides writing all of his novels, in promoting science fiction from the globe. And he wrote a series of anthologies, the apex books of science fiction, back in the early part of this decade. And then he did a new series, which is just coming out, The Best of World Science Fiction, which Adam Roberts, the historian of science fiction, says is the most important anthology of science fiction since Dangerous Visions. And so as a sample for you to get a little bit of a flavor here, I got through a lot of these stories just to see what was in them, these recent stories from across the globe. And these are ones that I picked out as the best of the 30 or so that I read out of those volumes. And interestingly, when it came down to it, I didn't pick out any that were from writers in Europe. It turned out that I thought the best story I ran into was out of Singapore, Zhang Zhu, which is a incredible, colorful piece of work combining H.P. Lovecraft, Douglas Adams, and everything under the sun in science fiction mixed together into this story about the independence of Singapore, the history of it. Just a very fascinating piece of work. Fandom for Robots, which also just recently came out of Singapore, I think won the Hugo, or at least was nominated for it, about a robot who becomes a science fiction writer. Other things I could say about some of these here, The Mighty Slinger is about a rock band in the future who becomes the cultural mover of all global politics. Couple stories from India. Delhi, excuse me, is a good, vivid picture of the past and the future woven together. The Child of Clay is about a robot, this came out of Uganda, who tries to create a baby robot. The story out of China, Your Multicolored Life, is a kind of commentary, political commentary on the Cold War and communism versus democracy, and very, very interesting. If at first you don't succeed, which did win the Hugo out of Malaysia, is a story about a creature who wants to become a dragon and keeps trying to become a dragon and can't seem to do it. But it's a varied list that I have up here. And looking through it, you see combinations of Western technology, Western ideas with the various cultures of other parts of the globe woven together in different interesting ways. So it's showing both influence of the West and the heritage of science fiction and the cultures of other countries where science fiction is becoming increasingly popular. Now, the one global writer I'm going to highlight at the end here, Yu Saxin, is representative of Ken Yu comment, China is dreaming and its dream contained multitudes. And among that multitudes is Yu Shen, if that's the right way to pronounce his name. I looked him up. Here's a quote from him. I think if humans want to survive, our only choice is to expand our living space in the universe. Like H.G. Wells once said, human beings will either fill the universe or perish completely. There is no other choice. And he is probably, if not the most popular Chinese science fiction writer of the last couple decades, and has won the Chinese Galaxy Award, which is their big award, 9 times since he started writing back around the year 2000. Now, the first thing became known for was his novella, The Wandering Earth, which won the Galaxy Award. And The Wandering Earth is about the entirety of humanity building giant jets across the surface of the Earth to move the entire Earth to the planetary system surrounding the star Proxima Centauri. And it's a great epic piece of work that was turned into 2 movies, but the stories are actually a lot richer and more expansive than the movies are. His short stories writing has been collected to Hold Up the Sky, and it contains a lot of his early stuff, his shorter stuff that was written during that first period of his writing career. But where he became especially globally known for was what he produced regarding alien invasion. And the quote I have up here is, "Contact with an alien civilization," this is from him, "has many possibilities. It might have a good outcome, equally might have terrible consequences. Any child knows not to open the door to strangers. They know not to greet strangers casually. This is a matter of common sense." And that's exactly what humans don't do in his trilogy, The Three-Body Problem, also called Remembrance of Earth Past. Starts in the Cultural Revolution in China. A woman sends a message on a giant radio apparatus into outer space. It is heard by aliens who live in the tri-star system of Proxima and Alpha Centauri. The aliens decide that the Earth is a much better place to live than their planet, which is constantly undergoing tremendous environmental transformations as it whips around 3 suns. And humans fractionate into different groups over whether it's a good thing that the aliens are coming or whether it's a terrible thing. And humans begin to prepare for this inevitable invasion. And while it's going on, the aliens send down 11-dimensional tiny little probes that monitor everything the humans are doing and prevent any technological advance. In the second volume, The Dark Forest, the story continues. A human blackmails the aliens into not invading us due to the threat of the alien world being blown up, because the universe is a dark forest where everybody hides from each other because of the fact that if you come out into the open, there's some more powerful alien force that will blow you up. And finally, concluding with Death's End, which goes out millions of years into the future, the aliens eventually come and turn our solar system from 3-dimensional into 2-dimensional, but they get wiped out too. And in the end, we have humans living in little bubbles of mini universes out there millions of years in the future, an incredible saga. They've made it into 3 different film versions already. The movie, the Chinese, and Netflix is coming out in 2 weeks. So we'll see what Netflix does with this immense space opera that's filled with both scientific and technological detail, speculation, culture of China, global issues, and very fascinating aliens, the Trisolarians. And most recently, he's actually done a 3-part nonfiction series on Rendezvous with the Future, talking about first contact, voyaging to the stars, and a super civilization for humanity in the future. Now, I know it's just 5 after. I started at about 5 after, so give me 5 more minutes and we were going to conclude. Now, just for your own opinionated reaction, here's my list of the best novels of the last decade. And I ended up with 30 up here. And I'm going to go through them quickly. The Fifth Season, The Calculating Stars, Blackfish City, Scalzi's Collapsing Empire, among others, Walton, Network Effect with Murderbot, The Dark Force, part of the trilogy from Liu Shen, Ancillary Justice, 2312, The Peripheral, Annihilation, A Memory Called Empire, Red Shirts by Scalzi also. That's two from Scalzi. Rapture of the Nerds, which I talked about last time, even though it came out in 2012 by Strauss and Doctorow, which I thought was very funny and technologically inventive, and Existence, which I talked about 2 times ago by David Brin, about contact with aliens in a very vivid, rich picture of the future. Death's End, a second one in the trilogy, the Three Body Problem trilogy at 15. The City in the Middle of the Night by Charlie Anders, which I thought was really good, and I didn't talk about it enough. I didn't have enough time, but a very interesting vision of an alternate world with humans in these strange cities. Embassy Town, which I talked about last time, China Meeville, which came out in 2011, which was a really good study in the challenge of trying to communicate with aliens who have a wholly different mode of consciousness. The Quantum Thief, which I talked about last time too, very technologically inventive with AI's vision of the future, out of Finland, actually. Central Station, almost in the top 10, highly recommended it. 7Es by Stevenson, really good depiction of 5,000 years in the future and what happens to humanity after a worldwide disaster. Ready Player One for its vision of virtual reality, which I thought was excellent. The Dervish House, which I talked about last time, about future Istanbul, came out in 2010. The Ministry of the Future by Robinson, that's 2 by Robinson in the last 10 years, that one coming in at 7. Leviathan Wakes, incredible space opera, definitely worth reading, even if you've seen The Expanse, but just very, very good, rich story of battles in outer space. Number 5, Children of Ruin, with the intelligent octopus and intelligent viruses or bacteria, and humans and spiders trying to communicate with them. I didn't say enough about that one, but the octopus or octopi are very fascinating in that. Number 4, All the Birds in the Sky by Anders. That's 2 by her, and that's the highest one for a woman science fiction writer. Number 3, The Three Body Problem. So I thought all 3 volumes of that series warranted the top 30. They were all good, but the first one was the best. Number 2, Children of Time with the Intelligent Spiders. That's 2 by Tchaikovsky. Now this one I have an asterisk by, number 1. And that's because technically it came out a little bit before the beginning of this last decade, but I hadn't talked about it before. And I thought, yeah, I'm going to put it here as number 1 because it definitely is top quality, philosophical, intelligent, world building, fantastical vision of this alternate reality with the monks and Anthem. So that's my top 30. Now, one more to go. Next time, in about a month, we're going to talk about summary conclusions and prospectus, even the devoted aficionado, wait, how do you pronounce that? Aficionado, or fan, has a hard time trying to explain science fiction, and the reason for this is that there is no fully satisfactory definition, is that there is no easily delineated limits to science fiction by a great science fiction writer, the Golden Age, Lester Del Rey, and I'll talk about themes and topics in science fiction, the values, overall view of novels and authors, why it's the evolutionary mythology, and the past and future of science fiction. And just to repeat, There's one other great graphic that Terry did. The graphics in here have been from Terry, and thank you, Terry, and that's the end. Okay. So let's go to the chats.